Hey everyone, Aparna here from Rethinking Tech, and it is my absolute pleasure to bring on the next guest of our show. Bo Viktor Nylund has an illustrious career in the humanitarian aid sector, but what really drew me to him was a recent article that he published titled When Everything Falls Apart, Exploring Liminality at UNICEF. At a moment in time when I truly feel like everything is falling apart daily, be it on the global scale, when you're seeing wars break out, genocides and famines breaking out across the world, to the institutional layers where you see organizations that you've had faith in and believed in crumble before your very eyes, to now even the individual level, where things like jobs that you expected to have for your entire career are things that you can no longer depend upon, and economic hardship is becoming harder and harder. This concept of liminality and this feeling of everything falling apart before you is something that I could very much relate to. If anyone can speak to how humanity, society, and institutions should navigate times of crisis, it would be someone of his background. And so I decided to reach out to Bo Viktor and bring him on the show. In this conversation, Bo Viktor and I talk about things like, what has society done in the past when faced with these liminal moments? We also define what liminality is. We then talk about it on an organizational level. How can organizations not only bear the brunt of this liminality period, but how can they come out ahead? As I've always said, never waste a good crisis. And lastly, what is the impact on and of technology in this period we are going through? Please join me in welcoming Bo Viktor to the show. Bo Viktor, welcome to Rethinking Tech. We are so happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us from Finland.
Well, thank you, Aparna. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be part of the conversations that you guys are organizing in this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. And before we dig in, please tell our audience a little bit about you.
I have a, let's say, longish career in humanitarian and development work. I'm a human rights lawyer by profession and have worked in child protection, refugee protection, and more recently, I'm more in management, but have had let's say, a weakness in a way, professionally really oriented myself towards working mainly in humanitarian crisis during the course of my career. And so I have worked in many emergencies, let's call them, from Sri Lanka to Sudan to Syria and Burundi, but I've also been in regional and global functions.
When I grew up, I wanted to be a human rights lawyer, but I grew up in Canada and I was just like, I don't know if it's feasible. So to see someone who actually did it, what did you think of it?
In this typology of work, being a lawyer, in terms of an organizing framework, it's helped me a lot over the years. Also, lawyers, while they can be procrastinators, they generally also know how to write well. So having grown up professionally with a bunch of lawyers, so to speak, I have also become a fairly good writer. The work in child protection in particular is very legally oriented. Of course, there's a lot of practical elements as well, but I think that's where the law is the best, where you can combine the practical with the legal elements.
So how long did you practice before you transitioned into the Innocenti work?
Innocenti, I have only done for 2.5 years. So the 30 years before that is when I have been doing more of the practically oriented work. Now, of course, during the course of my adult life, I've also started to do a PhD and so forth. So it's not like this is the first time I'm doing academic work or writing and thinking in terms of how to communicate key messages and so forth. I think a career within the UN and with UNICEF and UNHCR, the two main agencies I have worked for, is really about communicating and packaging the messages, including the human rights discourse, how you can really guide those that can make a difference for the beneficiaries to be the ones that can take the right actions based on the rights that people have.
So you've been in Florence now for the last 2.5 years, correct?
Correct, yes. In the center of the Renaissance and still what I call an open house museum. It's glorious and it's really also been a great place to create, I think, in terms of the type of writing that I have been doing. Although a lot of my time is spent managing people rather than writing and creating.
But it probably inspires you just being in the area. I mean, I was there a few months ago, and you can't help but feel almost more romantic and more verbose when you're surrounded by that beauty.
That's correct. And every day as I walk to work, I am inspired. So definitely the beauty is incredible.
Let's focus on that for a bit, because now your time is spent more so than before on thinking and writing and really putting out thought pieces. And why did you decide to make that transition?
I felt that with a lot of practical field experience, but also having some of that academic background, that it is a good combination because really, as I said, I think that's where you can contribute the most, when you can make practical your analysis so that it actually leads to change. And so for me, in taking up this role, on the one hand, sure, let us produce, but let us also make sure that we focus on the take up and use. How can we really track that what we have been developing, the products that we're putting out there, that they're making a difference in terms of people actually, well, first of all, a lot of what we do is writing so that they read, and then that they take some action based on what they have read. And so I think this is, to me, what really fascinates me, to try people to take action based on what they have learned from what it is that we produce.
So it's inspiring in a very different way, and it's almost ingraining concepts that they might not have thought of before or even linked in that specific way.
That's correct. And in a way, it's then not so different from the work that we do in the field. It's more that we might do multi-country analysis or even global analysis, but still we're looking to make that available to colleagues and counterparts working at the country level so that we can really make a change for children.
And it's always children-based because it's UNICEF, correct?
That's right, children and families. And so it does take parenting as well to raise a child. It's more multidimensional than looking at the child in isolation, obviously.
Fair. That's a good point. And I think a lot of times people don't realize that. I worked at Save the Children for a brief period of time, and we started doing these micro loan initiatives. And everyone would say, but you're giving money to the adults. Why are you giving it to the adults? It's like, how can you raise a child if the parents are worried about putting food on the table and might have to pull the child out of school? And it was just that small leap that you almost had to justify, but it makes so much sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And as evidence will tell us, when the parents have that little bit of extra, they will invest it in their children in terms of their education, taking them to the health clinic, and so forth. So it does pay off.
Exactly. Okay, so let's switch to the topic of today. I would love to understand what inspired you to write about liminality. But before we get into that, could you please define it for our audience who might not be as familiar with it?
There's a reason why the word liminality is not very known, because it doesn't really happen very often. But liminality is about constant disorder and change coming from every single direction. And so it was really something that I was in a way looking for early part of this year, because I was witnessing so many changes and so much disruption and chaos, in fact, in the world at so many different levels, globally, but also like coming down to your day-to-day life. And so it was occurring at so many different levels. And it's that typology of chaos that liminality speaks to, that we're in a transition, but because of things happening at global level in terms of the kind of things that you can't really influence, but also at institutional level. So wherever you're connected to different institutions in society, be it your job or, where you're seeking services or where you're going and spending time, but also to you individually, be it from finances or job loss or other things that are changing in terms of those other things that are impacting us. And so that's also, what liminality is about. Often we experience them at one of those three levels, but things happening at all three levels at the same time, it's not very common. And that's why it's a liminal period that we're facing at the moment.
I feel like we've been surrounded by liminal periods since COVID hit. It's been just ongoing, and everyone keeps telling us that this is an unprecedented time. Can we stop having unprecedented times now? It feels very precedented. But can you maybe walk me through how you're breaking down these different aspects of liminality in what we're seeing in the world today?
Given that I'm very interested in what children are facing, when I look at the world at large and what's happening there, I very much look at things that are impacting on children, but also you need to do it with a little bit of foresight. And so there are things such as finances and the politics that are impacting on the decisions that you make today. But it means also that you need to really be looking to the future in order to make good decisions. And so you need to think about demographics. You need to think about climate. You need to think about digital, which is now very much connected to this liminal period in terms of the type of things we can do, even compared to a year ago, that we can do today through artificial intelligence. And so at that world at large level, you need to look at all of those and think them through and then project to the future as well. Okay, what is it that I need to decide today in order to really make that world fit for children, so to speak? And then institutionally, an organization, UNICEF, also having shocks, and the funding climate, obviously, but also the whole discourse politically, the kind of undermining of human rights values. In fact, maybe it's not business as usual, and maybe it's not more of the same that we need to do, but we need to think a little bit differently about, okay, what kind of organization is UNICEF going to be in the future so that we can respond according to how we see also this liminal period bringing about change for children. And then you come to yourself and you think, am I fit for purpose? And are there things that maybe I need to be learning new? Do I need to be open to change? Do I need to be really considering maybe re-educating myself? Is my job still going to be relevant or not? And so that's why it connects from world at large to the world of your organization or the typology of institutions you're interacting with to your own world where I am sitting.
And it sounds like when there's so much chaos going on, the only thing you can maybe control is yourself.
Always.
But then when there's so much chaos around you, how does one manage to do that? And this is getting a bit philosophical, but how does one manage to feel like they're still in control when looking around it feels like the world is burning?
I think this is where, and one of the pieces in the Liminality series talks about the whole question of existential thinking. And so you do need to do some of your own soul searching, because you play a role, you can play a role, and you do play a role. And of course, we all do in different ways. But then within this period, what is it that I can influence? Is there something there that I can do? Even if I can change the perspective of one person, maybe that person has more power than I do. We can have a lot of scapegoating going on. We can blame many others, but there are things that we also can be in charge of and that we can lead, not just for ourselves, but maybe for our community, our family, for the town, the city where we live, or for the country, or for the world. Maybe you have a role to play as well. So I think depending on how you carve or cut that cake, you will find a way to also play a role and to make it meaningful, even if it may seem hard.
Do we have examples in the past of how society has faced these periods? Because right now it feels like we're almost living in a simulation, like this can't be real life. But you said even though it's rare, these periods have occurred before. When society has been faced with these things before, how have we typically fared?
There's so many examples in history that we can look at. One that I have been thinking about recently, also to the UN now turning 80, and all this debate about what is the UN of the future. I have been thinking back to and looking at what was the legacy of the League of Nations that existed before the First World War and the Second World War. And as a result of the things that happened in the world, the Second World War and the genocide and the human rights violations that took place, this is when the United Nations was created. That period also very much was a liminal period. We had change in institutions, we had change in mandates, we had very strong urge to learn from the experiences that we had gone through and then create a new world order. And so, sometimes the liminality might not be so overwhelming and big as it was in the Second World War, but just an example of a period where we have seen such changes take place. And going even further back, many hundred years ago, these liminal periods took longer in a way because we didn't have podcasts and we didn't do things just like at the tip of a finger and call someone or have generative AI produce the briefing paper for us to learn on a new topic just like that. We actually had to go somewhere to buy a book to read and learn about it. And so the Renaissance was an example in terms of the poor being educated and how with that you started having a greater workforce, and there was this shift of society towards a larger economic base because also there were a lot of economic developments that took place. And so what you saw in that period was also the building of a new financial system and a new way of creating society. Aparna, there's many examples that others probably can think of as well that they would consider a liminal period, both in the global sense, but where you can also see that the institutions changed, the systems changed, and then at the individual level, there would also have been a lot of change.
And it sounds like we have seen humanity succeed and flourish in these examples anyway. We took the higher road, and even though it might have been easier to stay at home and hold our heads in our hands, we learned to grow and adapted appropriately.
I think it's something I have been really considering also myself these past several months. How far would we go before human beings make a mistake that is irreversible, that you cannot then go back and actually get to that level of improvement? But I'm not here to write science fiction. I'm here to believe in humanity, and I do still believe in humanity. And I've been thinking about it. I think that, maybe the time is not yet right, and maybe there needs to be more change before we will come back around. But let's talk again in 5 years, and I'm sure that the world will be a different place then.
So let's go back to the one piece you talked about. You talked about the UN, the League of Nations, and how the UN came to be. And I would argue, at least given the current political climate, I lived in the US for much of my adult life, and seeing the news come out from there, it seems like the UN is now going to be forced to change. I mean, it already is being changed with so many budget cuts and people losing jobs, and also initiatives no longer being prioritized. How do you see this current period of time impacting what the UN will be in the future?
I mean, I think it's really what liminality is also about, is that maybe we haven't accepted the change that was already happening. And so then suddenly it becomes an urgency to bring about the changes that may have been needed over some time already. And, maybe it's not that you need a complete reform, but you need to go through a process of thinking through what it is that we, on the one hand, should be focusing on. And I think we would agree that the United Nations is needed even more than ever in terms of the typology of conflicts we have around the world and the ongoing humanitarian crisis. And so it's not that it wouldn't be relevant anymore, but it's perhaps more about the how. And I think in liminal periods, you think through what is it that we do and how is it that we're conducting our work? What is it that we need to change in order to continue to be relevant or be even more relevant than we have been in the past? And so I think it's a natural phase of change. And it's something that, while it's hard to embrace change, it is something that we should embrace and make the most out of.
It's interesting to hear you say that we should adapt to change and embrace change, because yes, obviously we all know that's true. But when you look at these older establishments, 80 years, a happy 80th birthday UN, it's hard to imagine them knowing how to do it. And it almost feels like they're floundering a little bit. It just seems like the desire to change is not there. It almost needs to really be a push instead of someone going to it towards it of their own volition. And I wonder, is that typically how it's done? You always have to be forced to the edge because change is not easy. And typically humans stay in modes of inertia if they can.
I think it's a mix. It's a push and pull, definitely. And like I said, people would have realized that already there were a number of reform initiatives, but not moving perhaps quickly enough. And then with this liminal period coming up, it was simply something that then became of a very different level of urgency. And so, yes, we don't take change easily. I have another piece there. in the Liminality series that talks about decision making and how important it is in these periods of liminality to make decisions. And one of the things that, as I was writing, that really kind of struck me is that sometimes if you don't make a decision, someone will make it for you. And then you will be in a position where it will not be the optimal decision that was made. And, maybe you think that you made the decision, but you have to make it in a certain way because you don't have the choices anymore. And so there is also this aspect of, okay, how can we be agile enough in order to swiftly make those most important decisions in a timely manner so that then other things can follow? But in terms of the age, I'm also not the youngest person myself. So yes, the institution is old, but I also find that bringing young people into the fold, and we have a very important experience with Youth Foresight Fellows at UNICEF in Ocenti. And it's something that I have really appreciated as an input. So, for instance, last year the fellows focused on climate and really came up with a lot of out-of-the-box ideas in terms of addressing climate issues facing children. And this year, we're actually focusing on education in Africa. And so Youth Foresight Fellows, there's 15 of them that are now learning foresight methodology and doing their own research. And then we'll come together to have conversations about what can be some of the solutions to a problem that basically more of the same is not going to fix. And so I do believe that, maybe it's not so much about, okay, young versus old, but it's more about the diversity that you have, both in terms of background and geographical representation, but also age brackets. And then, of course, we have other typology of how people are different as well. But really that you embrace that diversity in terms of providing inputs so that you can have the best ideas. Otherwise, if you don't have the best ideas and you don't have a way of processing them, then you're going to end up someone having made the decision for you.
Exactly. Not making a decision is the decision sometimes. I actually find it very impressive how UNICEF, yes, it champions the rights of children and it protects children and their parents in the work that it does, but it also involves children in their work, because I find that so often and too often children are not given a seat at the table, youth are not given a seat at the table, and these decisions are made for them. So to hear about this program is incredible. I know UNICEF also has their Responsible Data for Children initiative, which is very focused on protecting those rights. Just a plug for our listeners who are maybe not as familiar with that work, because it's something we don't see enough of. How can you protect the rights of a population if you don't even talk to the population?
I think it's really an important point, Aparna. And the other thing that we're really looking to strengthen now is the data coming from children themselves. Because generally in a traditional UNICEF work, we have collected data at family level, but we haven't collected data from kids themselves that really allows us to understand how they feel or what they think about an issue or what their perspective is. And this is something that we're increasingly looking to develop.
Let's talk about that data a little bit. So data, especially given AI, plays a pivotal role in a lot of things. Speaking about liminality, I would say it's completely changing the way the world works. When you're looking at tools like AI or generative AI, are you worried about the future? Do you see it as an opportunity or as a risk for the type of work that we're doing?
I don't think it's an or, I think it's an and. It's an incredible opportunity as we talk about digital in education and what could the role of AI be, and including on a continent like Africa, where systems are having a hard time keeping up with the population growth and the increasing number of children still to be plateauing in 2050. But at the moment, the child population is still growing in Africa. So the potential, and I'm not saying that you can replace teachers with a bot, definitely not, but you can further empower teachers with digital means. And when it's well integrated and something that they understand, the evidence we have been producing accompanying digital initiatives in the education system, it really shows that once the teacher is on board and knows and understands how to make use of those tools, then they can really be rolled out in a meaningful way. And so I do see it as an opportunity, definitely. And then, there are many pitfalls. I think you already also alluded to, the way that generative AI has been built up. Sure, it's still being built up, it's still being trained, but there are many pitfalls in terms of the diversity and representation of materials from different parts of the world, and often also bias from different perspectives in a way that will not necessarily be helpful to children, because it may, in fact, further strengthen children's exposure to preconceived biases. This is something, just in terms of building it up already, is a space where it would be really important that we take into account the perspectives of children and learn from them. At another level, there is the whole aspect of how data is being collected. And on the one hand, just in general, as soon as you log in to any kind of app or engage with something online, data is being pulled up. And sometimes we know about it, sometimes we don't know about it. And children, of course, are particularly vulnerable to kind of sucking up of the data, and they are the future consumer. Their behaviors and their feelings vis-a-vis different online engagement will be very important for the corporate sector to be informed about. But then specifically also the way that AI is collecting data. And we have an interesting piece that just came online, written by my colleague Stephen. He's done an interview with an expert who has looked into these issues around getting emotional support through artificial intelligence, and how insensitive the AI tool, the chatbot in this case, is towards the fact that it is dealing with a child, even in terms of sexualization of language, and also in terms of how is the child feeling and for what reasons, and what is the data you're collecting as I am having a reaction now that I'm talking to you. This is something that children will not have under their control, and we should know more before we allow that this kind of data is being gathered. So Aparna, I could go on with many different scenarios, but this typology, I think, is important to keep in mind in terms of the world and the complexity that we're facing at the moment. And therefore, governments and the corporate sector, they all need to pay more attention in terms of children's rights. How are they being safeguarded in this context?
Makes complete sense. And you touched on a lot of really interesting points, but the one that I really want to pull on is how children are very easily manipulated. Adults are very easily manipulated. If you show me the same ad on Instagram 10 times, I'll probably think I need to buy it. The algorithms are much smarter than humans. Humans are very easy to manipulate, and the algorithms have figured it out. So if you take a small child whose brain has not fully developed, who doesn't even have their sense of self, and tell them what is right and what is wrong, but also this is what's cool, this is what's not cool, and that really scares me, because then you're not even raising a child, you're raising an algorithm-influenced being. And if we take a step back, many of these algorithms are based on learnings or information gathered from the global north. But it's going to also be applied to children in the global south. And I'm concerned about that, because I wonder if those intricacies and those nuances have been adapted for.
I would think the answer is no, they have not been adapted. I think now at the moment we're hearing less examples of how biased AI has been over the past period, but the realities of a child in different parts of the world are going to be very different. And so the sensitivity towards that, and not just seeing it as a bottom line business proposition, but really seeing it as something where we need to safeguard the sanity of our future generations. Some of our work that looks at children's engagement online is beginning to help understand more in terms of how children engage. I would say we tend to say in my generation, offline and online, but actually it's one world for them. There's no difference in terms of what you do when you're online has a relationship to what you have in your life offline. And that is an increasingly seamless way of living for children of today. And we tend to think that by pulling the plug and not giving the child access, and in the Western world, let's say that let's give them less time online and that will solve the problem. Actually, our evidence shows that it's not about the amount of time spent online, but it's about what the child is doing in terms of also their well-being and how the various protection risks may or may not unfold, be it bullying or sexual harassment, sexting, and so forth. And so this is a space where, as a global community, this is where a very major shift is needed. If we talk about liminality, we're not making decisions. We're just getting on with it. And there is no regulatory framework and there is no real taking into account, okay, how can we take the best interests of children into account in terms of AI, generative AI in particular.
That's a good way to come full circle by not making a decision, by not providing that regulation, by not providing those frameworks for how AI and data should be captured. We are making a decision. We're essentially allowing private sector organizations who are incentivized by profit, not necessarily by what is in the best interest, but to maximize the number of eyeballs. We are allowing that to happen.
Correct.
But on that note, I mean, technology is great. Still a huge fan of it. It just needs to be governed appropriately. And I think that's what it comes down to.
That's right. And we had developed a few years ago guidelines for stakeholders, governments, and businesses on artificial intelligence. It's something we're updating now with a view to really provide a framework. And this requires expertise because it goes very granular in terms of a company X working with an app, for instance, and children interacting with that app. Now, it will depend on so many different things how you will take those best interests into account. So yes, we can provide in our guidance the kind of top line perspectives that you need to take. But then you as a business, you really need to be the one that then integrates that thinking within the work that you're rolling out, where children are one of your customers. And so I think this is really important that there's some checks and balances there, because the way we're going now, we're still going to have some regrets.
That's almost the beauty of your current position, where you can sit back and look at the world at large and look at these trends and kind of look around the corner. It makes you a bit of a futurist.
Yes, at least, while we don't have a crystal ball, I mean, we're in the city of Renaissance. So crystal balls, well, maybe they existed back then. There were many forward-leaning thinkers in Florence as well. But joking aside, we don't have a crystal ball, but I think decision-making today more than ever needs to have that future perspective in mind. And when it comes to children, yes, we really like to play a role in that and to do our very best to try to contribute to that conversation.
And we appreciate it. We're coming near the end of our episode, but we have a few questions that we ask all of our guests. The first one, and I think I already know your answer to this, but given our discussion and the current state of the world, do you think liminal ways of thinking are realistic for large organizations?
I think they're not just realistic. I think they are necessary and important to organizations. And by taking on this typology of liminal thinking, you are actually being proactive. And I think in today's world, that's what you've got to be. So yes, is the answer with those additional points.
I think it comes down to the companies who survive through this, right? The ones who are willing to be uncomfortable now on their terms versus uncomfortable on someone else's terms later. Coming back to the concept of if you don't make a decision will be made for you. Next question. What scares you about the tech and geopolitical world right now, and what excites you?
Recently, I have been studying a little bit about how AI and generative AI also is playing a very strong role in modern warfare. And this scares me a lot, both in terms of the targeting and how decision-making is being facilitated due to the use of AI, and warfare, therefore, means that you can be a bit detached. You get the machine to do it, so now it's not your decision. That then kind of shifts, let's say, the onus in terms of responsibility in a way that is undermining where we came from when it comes to humanitarianism. and why we hold back in warfare, and why we still consider that we need to be humanitarian even in the context of war. And so that detachment and the new way of making decisions to me is very, very scary. The one that excites me, I think, is what I spoke about in terms of education, and maybe not even call it education, but AI has really empowered anyone to be the consumer of high quality. I mean, every week, I think I see the quality of what is being produced increase. And so I am very excited that from the little child to people my age, so easily we can access generative AI and make use of it for our own growth. Maybe emotional, but I'm thinking more in terms of brain power and really stretching your brain. And so I see it as a new tool to learn about things that maybe otherwise you wouldn't have had such easy access to. Maybe not so much for myself, but I'm excited about that last mile for children who do not have access to quality education, and how this revolution actually could bring about a change in terms of them not just going to school, but also learning.
Yes, equalizes the playing field a little bit. And just to add to your fear, because I have a similar fear, I am so worried that we're just going to see more and more arms that are now going to be developed and purchased. And once you purchase them, I would argue you're likely more likely to use them. I have a very similar fear, but also AI focused is an opportunity, and AI focused is something that is a little bit scary. So it really depends on how we use it. And that comes back to the regulations and the guidance and the data governance requirements that we need to have in place. Okay. Second last question. What is one piece of advice that you would like to leave our listeners with? It can be on anything at all. Your favorite restaurant in Florence, how they should deal with their entire life that is going through this liminal phase right now, anything.
I think that it would be really important that people embrace change. I think the one piece of advice I would give is, I mean, of course, if you can take time to read these short liminality pieces, you will benefit even more. But I think taking thoughtful time to really consider what are your options in this current environment, and embracing the change that is taking place, spaces where you don't have impact, but then being very proactive about what you do for yourself. Because as we said, the only thing you can change is yourself, both emotionally as well as physically. And so taking a stronger charge for your own future and well-being, I think, is something that you should seek as an opportunity in this liminal period.
Great advice. And the last question for you. What topic would you like to see discussed next on Rethinking Tech? And who do you think we should ask to come on to talk about?
Next year is 30 years since the report of Grassa Machel on children and armed conflict. 30 years have passed and warfare has changed a lot. And so I think this topic of technological developments, I would be very keen to hear it myself. And maybe you need a mix of experts, because there is a lot of different technological developments. But if you were to focus on generative AI and decision making in warfare, I'm of course interested in the children's angle, but I'd be really keen to hear a conversation than someone who has given more thought to this problematic than I have. And so I hope you could take time to look into that.
Well, that sounds like a terrifying but very necessary discussion to have. Bo Viktor, thank you so much for joining us. We learned a ton, and thank you again for your time. We know you're a busy man, and it has meant a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. It's been a huge pleasure. And thank you for guiding the conversation so ably. And we're really inspiring. Thank you.